third and final session, learning via reading session today for the World Citizen Finance Initiative, and I'm going to correlate it with Coffee with Dragon since I'm drinking coffee while studying reading. Have begun in part one, of course, by Googling three beautiful, divine, holy words: global, financial, and system. Three words which have given us plethora, and we just scratched the surface of the universe of finance. Is I'm willing to acquire more wisdom, understanding, knowledge of the financial universe, so that for myself, my friends and allies and supporters, much needed for myself as I'm living in a financially precarious situation at the moment with about $10,000 in debt, paying interest. I paid it was just 4 days ago on the 4th of January, about $80 of interest on $10,000. And I'm unemployed. Pay $4 a month and hope that you do too, so that in case it's a good security, so that you don't pay bank fees. What's called overdraft protection, so that you have a limit up to a few $100s. So, because if you don't have it, of course, you pay banking fees, and there's millions and millions just in Canada of monthly banking fees. There's millions of dollars that tens of thousands of Canadians are paying monthly because the inability, and of course my United States brothers and sisters from the United States and across the world, because of the inability, of course, to budget. Individual budgets, collective budgets, local, national, international, financial budgets, part of budgeting, of course. So I said have that protection, but am unfortunately in the minus after paying rent, electricity, and phone bill. I applied for a job last week, doing volunteering in the community. I'm doing this. I'm hoping to make a living from my art, my poetry, I'm a writer, script writer. So universal spiritual teacher, that is, teaching diverse universal spirituality. Any help helps. Please make a donation if you can. May you be blessed threefold in return for any dollar that you do give, or yuan for that matter, or shekel, via PayPal at H.A.Dragan at hotmail.com via PayPal. Please specify it's to support this project, the World Citizen Finance. As the balance, my balance is minus 418 and 61 cents. Well, that being said, got coffee supply for at least 37 days, maybe even 66. So off we go. We continue third and final session of learning, studying via reading. After googling three beautiful occult divine words: global, financial, system. Smoot-Hawley Tariff of 1930. U.S. President Herbert Hoover signed the S-M-O-O-T, Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act into law on June 17, 1930. The tariff's aim was to protect agriculture in the United States, but congressional representatives ultimately raised tariffs on a host of manufactured goods, resulting in average duties as high as 53% on over 1,000 various goods. 25 trading partners responded in kind by introducing new tariffs on a wide range of U.S. goods. Hoover was pressured and compelled to adhere to the Republican Party's 1928 platform, which sought protective tariffs to alleviate market pressures on the nation's struggling agribusinesses and reduce the domestic unemployment rate. Hoover was pressured and compelled to adhere to the Republican Party's 1928 platform, which sought protective tariffs to alleviate market pressures on the nation's struggling agribusinesses and reduce the domestic unemployment rate. The culmination of the stock market crash of 1929, which, of course, um, Black Friday, looking black, Monday in black, Tuesday, 3 black days. Called black, I would have called them scarlet maybe, or whatever. Meaning to say that, what they mean to say is that on those 3 days the stock market fell more by the biggest points in 1929. It was started in October 24th, then October 29th, or October 24th, October 28th, because there was the weekend. It was on a Friday, which started like October 24th on a Friday, and then of course stock market closes for the weekend, and again next week. So 3 different days, and basically what it means was a drop, consecutive drop of thousands of much percentage in terms of the total percentage points. Of course, it triggered the Great Depression, which lasted for almost 10 years. Can you imagine? Almost 10 years. More than 9 years, but almost 10 years. Great Depression. The culmination of the stock market crash of 1929 and the onset of the Great Depression heightened fears. And I'm just going to go quickly to just make a note on the Great Depression, because I want to clarify that, just to make sure, to read a little bit about the Great Depression. I'm going to jump into it a bit. So Wall Street crash of 1929. It's going to take 3 minutes because it's an important history, and some say, many financial analysts, economic advisors, and historians say that we are on the onset of another crash that can happen in as early as February 11th. Not necessarily that February 11th. It can be February 7th, it can be February 19, it can be 18, it can be 20, but it's not necessarily on a Monday. It can happen Monday, since February 11th this year is on a Monday, or it could happen on a Friday, February 8th, or it could start on Friday, February 8th, continue dropping the stock market, that is February 11th, and then crashing on the 11 days in February, 11-day February crash, from February 11th to February 8th to February 19th, let's say, or the 20th. I mean, 13-day February crash, February 7th of February to Friday, February 22nd, 2019. stock market crash. Let's hope not. Let's hope not. We need financial healing, recovery, and security, locally, nationally, internationally. I've written many theories and proposals in the past 7 years for trying to achieve this. Although myself need support and collaboration at the present moment in time. And help, and support, cooperation. So it could be in February, let's say between February 7th, which is a Thursday, till February 22nd, which is a Friday. But back to the historical Wall Street crash of 1929. (1929), called Black Tuesday. The Wall Street crash of 1929, also known as the stock market crash of 1929 or the Great Crash, is the stock market crash that occurred in late October 1929. It started, okay, so this is what I wanted to clarify, because I've studied it years ago, but was not exactly sure 100%. I didn't want to make errors since it's very relevant for today as I'm recording this video. January 8th, 2019, when all the tariffs and the trade war between the biggest buyer market and consumer of goods, the United States, with the biggest exporter, producer, and seller of goods, China. Right, since 1984, China has risen to become today, January, to be today as I'm doing this video live now, January 8th, 2019. It's 1984, they have risen to become the world's biggest seller, producer, and exporter of goods, while the United States, of course, being today the biggest buyer, consumer, and importer of goods, and import and export, right? The world trade system tied in with the global financial system, which is what I've begun Googling and reading about, meditating and trying to learn. It started on October 24th. And this is what, because they call it the stock market crash or the Wall Street crash or the Great Crash, which triggered, of course, the Great Depression. It started on October 24th. Black Thursday, it's called. So basically, the stock started crashing on October 24th. That's why they call it Black Thursday. And continued until October 29th. So Black Thursday, because Thursday was October 24th. So then Friday was October 25th. So then October 26th and 27th, the markets was closed. The stock market was closed. Wall Street crash. Started on October 24th, Black Thursday, and continued until October 29th, 1929, Black Tuesday. Because Monday was the 28th, because the 26th and the 27th was Saturday and Sunday. So October 24th was Black Thursday, and then I don't know if it was a Black Friday or a Black Monday also, possibly, but this is what it says. It started on October 24th, Black Thursday, and continued until October 29th, Black Tuesday. And it doesn't say Black Monday or Black Friday, but Monday was October 28th, since it started on October 24th, Black Thursday. So Friday was the 25th, then Saturday was 26th, Sunday was 27th, so it's 26th and 27th of October, Saturday and Sunday respectively was closed. Then Monday was October 28th, 1929, and then 29th is Black Tuesday, what it's called, when share prices on the New York Stock Exchange collapsed. So it happened basically in 3 days, you could say. October 24th, approximately Friday, or no, if I remember correctly from history, Friday they rebounced a bit, and it was actually Black Monday. So Black Thursday, Black Monday, and Black Tuesday. It was the most devastating stock market crash in the history of the United States, when taking into consideration the full extent and duration of its after effects. The after effects. The crash, which followed the London Stock Exchange's crash of September, signaled the beginning of the 12-year Great Depression that affected all Western industrialized countries. 12 years Great Depression. Oh, 12-year Great Depression. The war, Second World War started in 1939, late 1939, 1940, some say 1940. Anyways, so black timeline. I'm not gonna read the whole thing. I just want to reread. Okay. So this I'm gonna read, and then I'm gonna go back to the selling intensified in mid-October. On October 24th, Black Thursday, the market lost 11% of its value at the opening bell on very heavy trading. 11%. Can you imagine? $100 will be worth 89, and $10 be worth 8.9. So 11%. It's a big. It's $11 of every $100. 11% of its value. The huge volume meant that the report of prices on the ticker tape in brokerage offices around the nation was hours late. So investors had no idea what most stocks were actually trading for at that moment, increasing panic. Several leading Wall Street bankers met to find a solution to the panic and chaos. On the trading floor, over the weekend, the events were covered by the newspapers across the United States. On October 28th, Black Monday. So it is Black Monday, it just wasn't mentioned there. More investors facing margin calls decided to get out of the market, and the slide continued with a record loss in the Dow for the day of 38.33 points, which at that period in time meant, of course the Dow now is a story, but back then 38.33 points meant 13%. Can you imagine Black Monday? So you had Black Thursday, and on Friday was a bit of rebound or settling or calm. On October 28th, which was after the weekend, because it started on the 24th, right? So 24th, Black Thursday. On the 25th was a Friday, which was more calm, and Saturday and Sunday closed, but the newspapers were reporting it across the United States and in the world. 26, 27 markets are closed. 28th, on October 28th, Black Monday. More investors facing margin calls decided to get out of the market, and the slide continued with a record loss in the Dow for the day of 38.33 points, or 13% at that period in time. Can you imagine 13%? So of every $100 worth, you lose 13 bucks. Like if you have $100, you lose 13 in one day. 13 bucks, a lot. 13%. Of 1,000 is 130. 10,000 is 1,300. 13% is a lot in a day. So the next day, Black Tuesday, October 29th, 1929, about 16 million shares traded as the panic selling reached its peak. some stocks actually had no buyers at any price that day. And somebody put here, but the citation is needed, air pockets. Because that's a more underground forces, Scorpio occult term, air pockets. The Dow lost an additional 30 points or 12% on Black Tuesday. The Dow lost an additional 30 points or 12%. So 12 plus 13, that's 25, right? Plus 11, that's 37%. Imagine 37%. 37% in 3 days. Black, 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 black. Tuesday, Black Monday, Black Thursday. Wow. So, the volume of stocks traded on October 29th, 1929 was a record that was not broken for nearly 40 years. Wow. The volume of stocks traded on October 29, 1929 was a record that was not broken for nearly 40 years. The volume of stocks traded on October 29, 1929 was a record that was not broken for nearly 40 years. So that's a bit what it was. And as an interesting point here with the change in the percentages. So during those after one day after a one day recovery on October 30th, where the Dow regained an additional 28.40 points or 12% to close at 258.47, the market continued to fall, arriving at an interim bottom on November 13, 1929. So that was the crash, financial crash, stock market crash, Wall Street crash. That happened in 3 major days and lost 37% of its value. Black Thursday, October 24th. Black Monday, October 28th. Black Tuesday, October 30th. We now continue our readings. The culmination of the stock market crash of 1929 and the onset of the Great Depression heightened fears, furthering pressuring Hoover to act on protective policies against the advice of Henry Ford and over 1,000 economists who protested by calling for a veto of the act. Henry Ford, I'm thinking that Henry Ford here refers to, I have to check, but yeah, Henry Ford, the inventor of the assembly line from Ford Motors, right? Advice of Henry Ford. Is that the one? Henry Ford, let me see. Against the advice of Henry Ford. over 1,000 economists who protested by calling for a veto of the act. Henry Ford, yes, in fact, is referring to the founder of Ford Motor Company and the assembly line inventor, or the sponsor of the development of the assembly line technique of mass production. Unfortunately, I'm always a bit triggered or in a feeling type of emotional way because Henry Ford, I don't know, it was something that overtook him, like a disease, a poison, a curse of anti-Semitism. And anyways, but yeah, Henry Ford is just into that. Not gonna Dragan is to Ford now, but nonetheless. So Hoover to act on protective policies against the advice of Henry Ford, and over 1,000 economists who protested by calling for a veto of the act. Exports from the United States plummeted 60% from 1930 to 1933. Wow, that's a lot, 60%. So 3 years it went down 60% to the worldwide. Exports from the United States plummeted 60% from 1930 to 1933. Worldwide international trade virtually ground to a halt. This is what happened after the 3 black days: Black Thursday, Black Monday, Black Tuesday. Worldwide international trade virtually ground to a halt. Worldwide international trade virtually ground to a halt. The international ramifications of the Smoot-Hawley tariff, comprising protectionist and discriminatory trade policies and bouts of economic nationalism, are credited by economists with prolongment and worldwide propagation of the Great Depression. Of the Great Depression. Formal abandonment of the gold standard. The classical gold standard was established in 1821 by the United Kingdom as the Bank of England enabled redemption of its banknotes for gold bullion. France, Germany, the United States, Russia, and Japan each embraced the standard one by one from 1878 to 1897, marking its international acceptance. The first departure from the standard occurred in August 1914 when these nations erected trade embargoes on gold exports and suspended redemption of gold for banknotes. Following the end of World War I, on November 11th, 1918, Austria, Hungary, Germany, Russia, and Poland began experiencing hyperinflation. So basically, hyperinflation is when the currency loses its value very fast. It can be a prolonged loss of value. Hyperinflation. It's important to clarify hyperinflation. So several cases. So that means that basically the purchasing power of the currency X, whatever the currency is that we're discussing, that is suffering from hyperinflation, meaning that it loses its value to purchase in percentages. So hyperinflation of 10%, meaning it's, or inflation of 10%, meaning it's buying 10% less milk, butter, bread, any good or service for that matter. Having informally departed from the standard, most currencies were freed from exchange rate fixing and allowed to float. Most countries throughout this period sought to gain national advantages and bolster exports by depreciating their currency values to predatory levels. A number of countries, including the United States, made unenthusiastic and uncoordinated attempts to restore the former gold standard. The early years of the Great Depression brought about bank runs in the United States, Austria, and Germany, which placed pressures on gold reserves in the United Kingdom to such a degree that the gold standard became unsustainable. Germany became the first nation to formally abandon the post-World War I gold standard when the Dresdner Bank implemented foreign exchange controls and announced bankruptcy on July 15, 1931. In September 1931, the United Kingdom allowed the pound sterling to float freely. By the end of 1931, a host of countries including Austria, Canada, Japan, and Sweden abandoned gold. Following widespread bank failures and the hemorrhaging of gold reserves, the United States broke free of the gold standard in 1933. France would not follow suit until 1936 as investors fled from the franc due to political concerns over Prime Minister Léon Blum's government. Trade liberalization in the United States. The disastrous effects of the Smoot-Hawley tariff proved difficult for Herbert Hoover's 1932 re-election campaign. Franklin D. Roosevelt became the 32nd U.S. president, and the Democratic Party worked to reverse trade protectionism in favor of trade liberalization. As an alternative to cutting tariffs across all imports, Democrats advocated for trade reciprocity. The U.S. Congress passed the Reciprocal Trade Agreements Act in 1934. The U.S. Congress passed the Reciprocal Trade Agreements Act in 1934. The U.S. Congress, I would like to read actually that next time when I'm doing that act, the Reciprocal Trade Agreements Act for U.S. Congress passed the Reciprocal Trade Agreements Act in 1934, aimed at restoring global trade and reducing unemployment. So this had the aim, this act, Reciprocal Trade Agreements Act. There's no link to it here to link it to further study it, unfortunately, but next time maybe kind of take a note and read about it, because it might be some value to it today, and how we can hopefully calm work for world peace, security, prosperity together across nations and borders, and not going to protectionism, nationalism, and racism, and Western chauvinism. Yeah. The U.S. Congress passed the Reciprocal Trade Agreements Act in 1934, aimed at restoring global trade and reducing unemployment. Aimed at restoring global trade and reducing unemployment. The legislation expressly authorized President Roosevelt to negotiate bilateral trade agreements and reduce tariffs considerably. If a country agreed to cut tariffs on certain commodities, the U.S. would institute corresponding cuts to promote trade between the two nations. If a country agreed to cut tariffs on certain commodities, the U.S. would institute corresponding cuts to promote trade between the two nations. Between 1934 and 1947, the U.S. negotiated 29 such agreements, and the average tariff rate decreased by approximately one-third during this same period. The legislation contained an important most favored nation clause, through which tariffs were equalized to all countries, such that trade agreements would not result in preferential or discriminatory tariff rates with certain countries on any particular import, due to the difficulties and inefficiencies associated with differential tariff rates. clause effectively generalized trade tariff reductions from bilateral trade agreements, ultimately reducing worldwide tariff rates. So it had a good effect. Its aim of reducing tariff rates. This is specified here that unemployment also was shortened and that global trade resumed. Of course, it took time, but it certainly did. And of course, the Great Depression that was triggered by the stock market crash on Black Thursday, Black Monday, and Black Tuesday, October 24th, October 28th, and 29th, respectively. As the inception of the United Nations as an intergovernmental entity slowly began formalizing in 1944, delegates from 44 of its early member states met at a hotel in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire, for the United Nations Monetary and Financial Conference, now commonly referred to as the Bretton Woods Conference. The name was actually United Nations Monetary and Financial Conference. Delegates remained cognizant of the effects of the Great Depression, struggles to sustain the international gold standard during the 1930s, and related market instabilities. Whereas previous discourse on the international monetary system focused on fixed versus floating exchange rates, Bretton Woods delegates favored pegged exchange rates for their flexibility. Under this system, nations would peg their exchange rates to the US dollar, which would be convertible to gold at 35 US dollars per ounce. This arrangement is commonly referred to as the Bretton Woods system. Rather than maintaining fixed rates, nations would peg their currencies to the US dollar and allow their exchange rates to fluctuate within a 1% band of the agreed upon parity. To meet this requirement, central banks would intervene via sales or purchases of their currencies against the dollar. Members could adjust their pegs in response to long-run fundamental disequilibria in the balance of payments, but were responsible for correcting imbalances via fiscal and monetary policy tools before resorting to repegging strategies. The adjustable pegging enabled greater exchange rate stability for commercial and financial transactions, which fostered unprecedented growth in international trade and foreign investment. This feature grew from delegates' experience in the 1930s when excessively volatile exchange rates and the reactive protectionist exchange controls that followed proved destructive to trade and prolonged the deflationary effects of the Great Depression. Capital mobility faced de facto limits under the system as governments instituted restrictions on capital flows and aligned their monetary policy to support their pegs. An important component of the Bretton Woods agreements was the creation of two new international financial institutions. The International Monetary Fund, also known as the IMF, and the International Bank for Reconstruction and Development, the IBRD, collectively referred to as the Bretton Woods institutions. They became operational in 1947 and 1946, respectively. The IMF was established to support the monetary system by facilitating cooperation on international monetary issues. Providing advisory and technical assistance to members and offering emergency lending to nations experiencing repeated difficulties restoring the balance of payments equilibrium. Members would contribute funds to a pool according to their share of gross world product, from which emergency loans could be issued. Member states were authorized and encouraged to employ capital controls as necessary to manage payments imbalances and meet pegging targets, but prohibited from relying on IMF financing to cover particularly short-term capital hemorrhages. While the IMF was instituted to guide members and provide a short-term financing window for recurrent balance of payments deficits, the IBRD was established to serve as a type of financial intermediary for channeling global capital toward long-term investment opportunities and post-war reconstruction projects. The creation of these organizations was a crucial milestone in the evolution of the international financial architecture, and some economists consider it the most significant achievement of multilateral cooperation following World War II. Since the establishment of the International Development Association (IDA) in 1960, the IBRD and IDA are together known as the World Bank. While the IBRD lends to middle-income developing countries, the IDA extends the bank's lending program by offering concessional loans and grants to the world's poorest nations. General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade 1947. In 1947, 23 countries concluded the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade (GATT) at the UN conference in Geneva. Delegates intended the agreement to suffice, while member states would negotiate creation of a UN body to be known as the International Trade Organization. As the ITO never became ratified, GATT became the de facto framework for later multilateral trade negotiations. Members emphasized trade reciprocity as an approach to lowering barriers in pursuit of mutual gains. The agreement's structure enabled its signatories to codify and enforce regulations for trading of goods and services. GATT was centered on two precepts. Trade relations needed to be equitable and non-discriminatory, and subsidizing non-agricultural exports needed to be prohibited. As such, the agreement's most favored nation clause prohibited members from offering preferential tariff rates to any nation that it would not otherwise offer to fellow GATT members. In the event of any discovery of non-agricultural subsidies, members were authorized to offset such policies by enacting countervailing tariffs. The agreement provided governments with a transparent structure for managing trade relations and avoiding protectionist pressures. However, GATT's principles did not extend to financial activity, consistent with the era's rigid discouragement of capital movements. The agreement's initial round achieved only limited success in reducing tariffs. While the US reduced its tariffs by one-third, other signatories offered much smaller trade concessions. Resurgence of financial globalization, flexible exchange rate regimes 1973 to present. World reserves of foreign exchange and gold in billions of US dollars in 2009. Although the exchange rate stability sustained by the Bretton Woods system facilitated expanding international trade, this early success masked its underlying design flaw, wherein there existed no mechanism for increasing the supply of international reserves to support continued growth in trade. The system began experiencing insurmountable market pressures and deteriorating cohesion among its key participants in the late 1950s and early 1960s. Central banks needed more US dollars to hold as reserves, but were unable to expand their money supplies if doing so meant exceeding their dollar reserves and threatening their exchange rate pegs. To accommodate these needs, the Bretton Woods system depended on the United States to run dollar deficits. As a consequence, the dollar's value began exceeding its gold backing. During the early 1960s, investors could sell gold for a greater dollar exchange rate in London than in the United States, signaling to market participants that the dollar was overvalued. Belgian-American economist Robert Triffin defined this problem, now known as the Triffin dilemma, in which a country's national economic interests conflict with its international objectives as the custodian of the world's reserve currency. France voiced concerns over the artificially low price of gold in 1968 and called for returns to the former gold standard. Meanwhile, excess dollars flowed into international markets as the United States expanded its money supply to accommodate the costs of its military campaign in the Vietnam War. Its gold reserves were assaulted by speculative investors following its first current account deficit since the 19th century. In August 1971, President Richard Nixon suspended the exchange of US dollars for gold as part of the Nixon shock. The closure of the gold window effectively shifted the adjustment burdens of a devalued dollar to other nations. Speculative traders chased other currencies and began selling dollars in anticipation of these currencies being revalued against the dollar. These influxes of capital presented difficulties to foreign central banks, which then faced choosing among inflationary money supplies, largely ineffective capital controls, or floating exchange rates. Following these woes surrounding the US dollar, the dollar price of gold was raised to 38 US dollars per ounce, and the Bretton Woods system was modified to allow fluctuations within an augmented band of 2.25% as part of the Smithsonian Agreement signed by the G10 members in December 1971. The arrangement delayed the system's demise for a further 2 years. The system's erosion was expedited not only by the dollar devaluations that occurred, but also by the oil crisis of the 1970s, which emphasized the importance of international financial markets in petrodollar recycling and balance of payments financing. Once the world's reserve currency began to float, other nations began adopting floating exchange rate regimes. The Bretton Woods Financial Order, 1976. International Monetary Fund. Headquarters of the International Monetary Fund in Washington, D.C. As part of the First Amendment to its Articles of Agreement in 1969, the IMF developed a new reserve instrument called Special Drawing Rights, SDRs, which could be held by central banks and exchanged among themselves as the fund as an alternative to gold. SDRs entered service in 1970, originally as units of a market basket of 16 major vehicle currencies of countries whose share of total world exports exceeded 1%. The basket's composition changed over time and presently consists of the US dollar, euro, Japanese yen, Chinese yuan, and British pound. Beyond holding them as reserves, nations can denominate transactions among themselves and the fund in SDRs. Although the instrument is not a vehicle for trade, in international transactions, the currency's basket's portfolio characteristic affords greater stability against the uncertainties inherent within free-floating exchange rates. Special drawing rights were originally equivalent to a specified amount of gold, but were not directly redeemable for gold and instead served as a surrogate in obtaining other currencies that could be exchanged for gold. The fund initially issued 9.5 billion XDR from 1970 to 1972. IMF members signed the Jamaica Agreement in January 1976, which ratified the end of the Bretton Woods system and reoriented the fund's role in supporting the international monetary system. The agreement officially embraced the flexible exchange rate regimes that emerged after the failure of the Smithsonian Agreement measures. In tandem with floating exchange rates, the agreement endorsed central bank interventions aimed at clearing excessive volatility. The agreement retroactively formalized the abandonment of gold as a reserve instrument, and the fund subsequently demonetized its gold reserves, returning gold to members or selling it to provide poor nations with relief funding. Developing countries and countries not endowed with oil export resources enjoyed greater access to IMF lending programs as a result. The fund continued assisting nations experiencing balance of payments deficits and currency crises, but began imposing conditionality on its funding that required countries to adopt policies aimed at reducing deficits through spending cuts and tax increases, reducing protective trade barriers, and contractionary monetary policy. The Second Amendment to the Articles of Agreement was signed in 1978. It legally formalized the free-floating acceptance and gold demonetization achieved by the Jamaica Agreement, and required members to support stable exchange rates through macroeconomic policy. The post-Bretton Woods system was decentralized in that member states retained autonomy in selecting an exchange rate regime. The amendment also expanded the institution's capacity for oversight and charged members with supporting monetary sustainability by cooperating with the fund on regime implementation. This role is called IMF surveillance and is recognized as a pivotal point in the evolution of the fund's mandate, which was extended beyond balance of payments issues to broader concern with internal and external stresses on countries' overall economic policies. Under the dominance of flexible exchange rate regimes, the foreign exchange markets became significantly more volatile. In 1980, newly elected U.S. President Ronald Reagan's administration brought about increasing balance of payments deficits and budget deficits. To finance these deficits, the United States offered artificially high real interest rates to attract large inflows of foreign capital. Foreign capital. As foreign investors' demand for US dollars grew, the dollar's value appreciated substantially until reaching its peak in February 1985. The US trade deficit grew to 160 billion in 1985. It was 341 billion in the equivalent of 341 billion in 2012 dollars. So in 1985, the trade deficit was 160 billion, but with inflation in 2012 dollars, it's actually 341 billion. As a result of the dollar's strong appreciation, the G5 met in September 1985 at the Plaza Hotel in New York City and agreed that the dollar should depreciate against the major currencies to resolve the United States trade deficit, and pledged to support this goal with concerted foreign exchange market interventions in what became known as the Plaza Accord. The US dollar continued to depreciate, but industrialized nations became increasingly concerned that it would decline too heavily and that exchange rate volatility would increase. To address these concerns, the G7, now G8, held a summit in Paris in 1987, where they agreed to pursue improved exchange rate stability and better coordinate their macroeconomic policies in what became known as the Louvre Accord. This accord became the provenance of the managed float regime by which central banks jointly intervened to resolve under and overvaluations in the foreign exchange market to stabilize otherwise freely floating currencies. Exchange rates stabilized following the embrace of managed floating during the 1990s, with a strong U.S. economic performance from 1997 to 2000 during the dot-com bubble. After the 2000 stock market correction of the dot-com bubble, the country's trade deficit grew. The September 11th attacks increased political uncertainties, and the dollar began to depreciate in 2001. European monetary system. Following the Smithsonian Agreement, member states of the European Economic Community adopted a narrower currency band of 1.125% for exchange rates among their own currencies, creating a smaller scale fixed exchange rate system known as the snake in the tunnel. I'm learning something new. See, I find snakes a beautiful, occult, divine. Right? Although many people have a negative view of snakes, it's not always so. Snake can be a divine, beautiful, mysterious being. Rainbow snakes. I would love to have just rainbow snakes. Well, also with black and white. Black, white, and then in between all the colors of the rainbow, the 7 colors. Yeah, love it. Finance helped me continuing in World Citizen Finance Initiative by making a donation via PayPal using the following email, and may you be blessed threefold for every dollar that you do provide me, which I do strongly need as I'm in debt $10,000, paying interest $80 a month about, and for minus $418.61 in bank, that have food, coffee, clothes, shelter. I think one good friend for moral, educational, spiritual support, two actually good friends, family. Besides, open my house to all to collaborate, work with me, support me via PayPal, making a donation at the following email: h.dragan@hotmail.com. Specifies to support me continuing making videos for the World Citizen Finance reading. Make a donation. May be blessed, threefold in kind. Yeah, PayPal, do give at h.a.dragan@hotmail.com. Fix the share system known as the snake in the tunnel. Snake in the tunnel. I have to read 3 minutes of this because it's fascinating. I'm learning that this is actually an article, and this is what they call the snake in the tunnel. Is that a cool name? I'm gonna read the whole article. We're gonna go back. Snake in the tunnel. The snake in the tunnel was the first attempt at European monetary cooperation in the 1970s. I disagree that it was the first. It was not the first. Probably not. Before we had in monetary cooperation in ancient Babylon, in ancient Israel, of course, with my great 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 grandfather King Solomon, cooperation with other nations, financial, monetary, commercial cooperation. But anyways, of course, ancient Egypt, the whole world, the Bible, Genesis chapter 37. The snake in the tunnel was the first attempt at European monetary cooperation in the 1970s, aiming at limiting fluctuations between different European currencies. It was an attempt at creating a single currency band for the European Economic Community, essentially pegging all the EEC currencies to one another. Pierre Werner presented a report on economic and monetary union to the EEC on 8 October 1970. The first of three the first of three The first of three recommended steps involved the coordination of economic policies and a reduction in fluctuations between European currencies. With the failure of the Bretton Woods system, with the Nixon shock in 1971, the Smithsonian Agreement set bands of plus 2.25% for currencies to move relative to their central rate against the US dollar. This provided a tunnel within which European currencies could trade. However, it implied much larger bands in which they could move against each other. For example, if currency A started at the bottom of its band, it could appreciate by 4.5% against the dollar, while if currency B started at the top of its band, it could depreciate by 4.5% against the dollar. If both happened simultaneously, then currency A would appreciate by 9% against currency B. This was seen as excessive, and the Basel Agreement in 1972 between the 6 existing EEC members and 3 about to join established a snake in the tunnel with bilateral margins between their currencies limited to 2.25%, implying a maximum change between any two currencies of 4.5%, and with all the currencies tending to move together against the dollar. This agreement also led to the formal end of the sterling area. The tunnel collapsed in 1973 when the US dollar floated freely. The snake proved unsustainable, with several currencies leaving and in some cases rejoining. By 1977, it had become a Deutsche Mark, that is the currency of Germany, zone with just the Belgian and Luxembourg franc, the Dutch guilder and the Danish krone tracking it. The Werner Plan was abandoned. The European monetary system followed the snake as a system for monetary coordination in the EEC. Last edited 3 years ago. Wow, this is fascinating. So I knew about this, but not necessarily about this specific one. So the snake in the tunnel was the first attempt at European monetary cooperation in the 1970s, aiming at limiting fluctuations between different European currencies. It was an attempt at creating a single currency band for the European Economic Community. Has become the European Union today. Essentially pegging all the EEC currencies to one another. Pierre Werner presented a report on economic and monetary union to the EEC on 8 of October 1970. The first of three recommended steps involved the coordination of economic policies and a reduction in fluctuations between European currencies. With the failure of the Bretton Woods system with the Nixon shock in 1971, the Smithsonian Agreement set bans of 2.25% for currencies to move relative to their central rate against the US dollar. This proved a tunnel within which European currencies could trade. However, it implied much larger bands in which they could move against each other. For example, if currency A started at the bottom of its band, it could appreciate by 4.5% against the dollar, while if currency B started at the top of its band, it could depreciate by 4.5% against the dollar. If both happen simultaneously, then currency A would appreciate by 9% against currency B. This was seen as excessive, and the Basel Agreement in 1972 between the 6 existing EEC members and 3 about to join established a snake in the tunnel with bilateral margins between their currencies limited to 2.25%, implying a maximum change between any two currencies of 4.5%, and with all the currencies tending to move together against the dollar. This agreement also led to the formal end of the sterling area. The tunnel collapsed in 1973 when the US dollar floated freely. The snake proved unsustainable, with several currencies leaving and in some cases rejoining. By 1977, it had become a Deutsche Mark zone with just the Belgian and Luxembourg franc, the Dutch guilder, and the Danish krona tracking it. The Werner Plan was abandoned. The European monetary system followed the snake as a system for monetary coordination in the EEC. Fascinating, isn't it? Wow. Gotta read this again because it's my the snake in the tunnel. The snake in the tunnel was the first attempt at European monetary cooperation in the 1970s. aiming at limiting fluctuations between different European currencies. It was an attempt at creating a single currency band for the European Economic Community (EEC), essentially pegging all the EEC currencies to one another. Pierre Werner presented a report on economic and monetary union to the EEC on 8 October 1970. The first of three recommended steps involved the coordination of economic policies and a reduction in fluctuations between European currencies. With the failure of the Bretton Woods system with the Nixon shock in 1971, the Smithsonian Agreement set bands of 2.25% for currencies to move relative to their central rate against the US dollar. This provided a tunnel within which European currencies could trade. However, it implied much larger bands in which they could move against each other. For example, if currency A started at the bottom of its band, it could appreciate by 4.5% against the dollar, while if currency B started at the top of its band, it could depreciate by 4.5% against the dollar. If both happened simultaneously, then currency A would appreciate by 9% against currency B. This was seen as excessive, and the Basel Agreement in 1972 between the six existing EEC members and three about to join established a snake in the tunnel with bilateral margins between their currencies limited to 2.25%, implying a maximum change between any two currencies of 4.5%, and with all the currencies tending to move together against the dollar. This agreement also led to the formal end of the sterling area. The tunnel collapsed in 1973 when the US dollar floated freely. The snake proved unsustainable, with several currencies leaving and in some cases rejoining. By 1977, it had become a Deutsche Mark zone with just the Belgian and Luxembourg franc, the Dutch guilder, and the Danish krone tracking it. The Werner Plan was abandoned. The European monetary system followed the snake as a system for monetary coordination in the EEC. In the EEC. Back to global financial system, wrapping it up. A few more minutes of reading, and that was fascinating. Wisdom, understanding, and knowledge. The snake proved unsustainable and it did not compel EEC countries to coordinate macroeconomic policies. In 1979, the European monetary system phased out the currency snake. The EMS featured two key components. In 1979, the European Monetary System (EMS) phased out the currency snake. The EMS featured two key components: the European Currency Unit (ECU) an artificial weight average market basket of European Union members' currencies, and the exchange rate mechanism (ERM), a procedure for managing exchange rate fluctuations in keeping with a calculated parity grid of currencies per values. The parity grid was derived from parities each participating country established for its currency with all other currencies in the system. Denominated in terms of ECUs, the weights within the ECU changed in response to variances in the values of each currency in its basket. Under the ERM, if an exchange rate reached its upper or lower limit within a 2.25% band, both nations in that currency pair were obligated to intervene collectively in the foreign exchange market and buy or sell the under or overvalued currency as necessary to return the exchange rate to its per value according to the parity matrix. Fascinating, isn't it? Wow. The requirement of cooperative market intervention marked a key difference from the Bretton Woods system. Similarly to Bretton Woods, however, EMS members could impose capital controls and other monetary policy shifts on countries responsible for exchange rates approaching their bounds, as identified by a divergence indicator which measured deviations from the ECU's value. The central exchange rates of the parity grid could be adjusted in exceptional circumstances and were modified every 8 months on average during the system's initial 4 years of operation. During its 20-year lifespan, these central rates were adjusted over 50 times. Birth of the World Trade Organization, 1994. The Uruguay round of GATT multilateral trade negotiations took place from 1986 to 1994, with 123 nations becoming party to agreements achieved throughout the negotiations. Among the achievements were trade liberalization in agricultural goods and textiles, the General Agreement on Trade in Services, and agreements on intellectual property rights issues. The key manifestation of this round was the Marrakesh Agreement. The key manifestation of this round was the Marrakesh Agreement in April 1994. The key manifestation of this round was the Marrakesh Agreement signed in April 1994, which established the World Trade Organization known as the WTO. The WTO is a chartered multilateral trade organization charged with continuing the GATT mandate to promote trade, govern trade relations, and prevent damaging trade practices or policies. It became operational in January 1995. Compared with its GATT Secretariat predecessor, the WTO features an improved mechanism for settling trade disputes since the organization is membership-based and not dependent on consensus, as in traditional trade negotiations. This function was designed to address prior weaknesses, whereby parties in dispute would invoke delays, obstruct negotiations, or fall back on weak enforcement. In 1997, World Trade Organization members reached an agreement which committed to softer restrictions on commercial financial services, including banking services, securities trading, and insurance services. These commitments entered into force in March 1999, consisting of 70 governments accounting for approximately 95% of worldwide financial services. Wow. These commitments entered into force in March 1999, consisting of 70 governments accounting for approximately 95% of worldwide financial services. Wow. These commitments entered into force in March 1999, consisting of 70 governments accounting for approximately 95% of worldwide financial services. Financial integration and systemic crisis 1980 to present day. Number of countries experiencing a banking crisis in each year since 1800, and there's a graph. This covers 70 countries. The dramatic feature of this graph is the virtual absence of banking crisis during the period of the Bretton Woods system, 1945 to 1971. This analysis is similar to financial integration among industrialized nations grew substantially during the 1980s and 1990s, as did liberalization of their capital accounts. Integration among financial markets and banks rendered benefits such as greater productivity and the broad sharing of risk in the macroeconomy. The resulting interdependence also carried a substantive cost in terms of shared vulnerabilities and increased exposure to systemic risks. Accompanying financial integration in recent decades was a succession of deregulation. Accompanying financial integration in recent decades was a succession of deregulation. Accompanying financial integration in recent decades was a succession of deregulation, in which countries increasingly abandoned regulations over the behavior of financial intermediaries and some simplified requirements of disclosure to the public and to regulatory authorities. Note 37. Note 37. Note 37. As economies became more open, nations became increasingly exposed to external shocks. Economists have argued greater worldwide financial integration has resulted in a more volatile capital flows, thereby increasing the potential for financial market turbulence. Given greater integration among nations, a systemic crisis in one can easily infect others. Given greater integration among nations, a systemic crisis in one can easily affect others. Given greater integration among nations, a systemic crisis in one can easily infect others. The 1980s and 1990s saw a wave of currency crises and sovereign defaults, including the 1987 Black Monday stock market crashes, 1992 European monetary system crisis, 1994 Mexican peso crisis, 1997 Asian currency crisis, 1998 Russian financial crisis, and the 1998-2002 Argentine peso crisis. These crises differed in terms of their breadth, causes, and aggravations, among which were capital flights brought about by speculative attacks on fixed exchange rate currencies perceived to be mispriced given a nation's fiscal policy, self-fulfilling speculative attacks by investors expecting other investors to follow suit given doubts about a nation's currency peg, lack of access to developed and functioning domestic capital markets in emerging market countries, and current account reversals during conditions of limited capital mobility, and dysfunctional banking systems. Following research of systemic crises that plagued developing countries throughout the 1990s, economists have reached a consensus that liberalization of capital flows carries important prerequisites if these countries are to observe the benefits offered by financial globalization. Such conditions include stable macroeconomic policies, healthy fiscal policy, robust bank regulations, and strong legal protection of property rights. Economists largely favor adherence to an organized sequence of encouraging foreign direct investment (FDI), foreign direct investment, liberalizing domestic equity capital, and embracing capital outflows and short-term capital mobility. Only once the country has achieved functioning domestic capital markets and established a sound regulatory framework, an emerging market economy must develop a credible currency in the eyes of both domestic and international investors to realize benefits of globalization, such as greater liquidity, greater savings at higher interest rates, and accelerated economic growth. If a country embraces unrestrained access to foreign capital markets without maintaining a credible currency, it becomes vulnerable to speculative capital flights and sudden stops, which carry serious economic and social costs. Countries sought to improve the sustainability and transparency of the global financial system in response to crises in the 1980s and 1990s. The Basel Committee on Banking Supervision was formed in 1974 by the G10 member central bank governors to facilitate cooperation on the supervision and regulation of banking practices. It is headquartered at the Bank for International Settlements in Basel, Switzerland. The committee has held several rounds of deliberation known collectively as the Basel Accords. The first of these accords, known as Basel I, took place in 1988 and emphasized credit risk and the assessment of different asset classes. Basel I was motivated by concerns over whether large multinational banks were appropriately regulated, stemming from observation during the 1980s Latin American debt crises. Following Basel I, the committee published recommendations on new capital requirements for banks, which the G10 nations implemented 4 years later. In 1999, the G10 established the Financial Stability Forum, reconstituted by the G20 in 2009 as the Financial Stability Board, to facilitate cooperation among regulatory agencies and promote stability in the global financial system. The forum was charged with developing and codifying 12 international standards and implementation thereof. The Basel II Accord was set in 2004 and again emphasized capital requirements as a safeguard against systemic risk, as well as the need for global consistency in banking regulations so as not to competitively disadvantage banks operating internationally. It was motivated by what were seen as inadequacies of the first accord, such as insufficient public disclosure of banks' risk profiles and oversight by regulatory bodies. Members were slow to implement it, with major efforts by the European Union and the United States taking place as late as 2007 and 2008. In 2010, in 2010, In 2010, the Basel Committee revised the capital requirements in a set of enhancements to Basel II known as Basel III, which centered on a leverage ratio requirement aimed at restricting excessive leveraging by banks. In addition to strengthening the ratio, Basel III modified the formulas used to weigh risk and compute the capital thresholds necessary to mitigate the risks of bank holdings, concluding the capital threshold should be set at 7% of the value of a bank's risk-weighted assets. Birth of the European Economic and Monetary Union 1992. In February 1992, European Union countries signed the Maastricht Treaty, which outlined a three-stage plan to accelerate progress toward economic and monetary union. In February 1992, European Union countries signed the Maastricht Treaty, which outlined a three-stage plan to accelerate progress toward an economic and monetary union. February 1992, European Union countries signed the Maastricht Treaty, which outlined a three-stage plan to accelerate progress towards an economic and monetary union. The first stage centered on liberalizing capital mobility and aligning macroeconomic policies between countries. The second stage established the European Monetary Institute, which was ultimately dissolved in tandem with the establishment in 1998 of the European Central Bank (ECB), a European system of central banks. Key to the Maastricht Treaty was the outlining of convergence criteria that EU members would need to satisfy before being permitted to proceed. The third and final stage introduced a common currency for circulation known as the euro, adopted by 11 of then 15 members of the European Union in January 1999. In doing so, they disaggregated their sovereignty in matters of monetary policy. These countries continued to circulate their national legal tenders, exchangeable for euros at fixed rates, until 2002, when the ECB began issuing official euro coins and notes. As of 2011, the EMU comprises 17 nations which have issued the euro and 11 non-euro states. Global financial crisis. Following the market turbulence in the 1990s, financial crisis, and the September 11th attacks on the US in 2001, financial integration intensified among developed nations and emerging markets, with sustained substantial growth in capital flows among banks and in the trading of financial derivatives and structured financial products. Worldwide international capital flows grew from 3 trillion to 11 trillion US dollars from 2002 to 2007.